So before this event started, I looked at a quick look at the New York Times webpage, and the lead story was some Israeli government officials who were acknowledging that, yes, they were about to be inflicting what they feared was, or what they feared, I don't know if fear is the word, what they thought would be mass starvation in Gaza. And the question arises as to how the hell this happened, how we got here. And that story was not the first time that the New York Times has delved into talking to Israeli officials who will acknowledge some of the horrors that have become indigenous to that small part of the world. It was 1 year ago this week that the New York Times Sunday magazine ran a almost book-length feature by two New York Times writers, Ronen Bergman, who was a staff writer based in Tel Aviv, and Mark Mazzetti, who is a Washington-based writer on security and intelligence agencies. Over the course of years that Ronen in particular had spent covering Israel and Palestine, they collected a whole series of hitherto unknown or unacknowledged realities in that region, and ended up publishing a year ago this week, a story entitled The Unpunished, How Extremists Took Over Israel. In Dostoevsky speak, we might call that a tale of crime and no punishment. It documented in great detail how Israeli government agencies have been turning a blind eye to settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank and the seizure of their property, not just since October 7th, but almost consistently for the past half century. And that becomes interwoven with the, in many ways, even larger story they told, which is the rise of the Israeli far right, of violent settler extremists, of Judeo-theocrats, who were once beyond the pale of Israel's right-wing nationalist Jabotinsky parties, but who today hold the key national policy positions in the current Israeli government. Their reporting encompassed more than 100 interviews, as I said, conducted over years, not just with Palestinians, not just with Israeli human rights activists, but with leading figures in the Israeli armed forces, the police forces, the Shin Bet, its intelligence agency, many of whom told stories of what amounted to the Israeli government's de facto but consistent policy of ignoring, in almost all cases, Jewish violence against West Bank Palestinians. And like some of you, I've followed at a distance some of these stories for a long time, as I have the rise of Israelis ultra-right, particularly in as much as many of its key figures started life as American-based Jews. But what they revealed, even to scholars of Israeli policy and scholars of Israeli-Palestinian relations and scholars of the Israeli right, they revealed events and contexts that even these people had not known before Bergman and Mazzetti uncovered them, and before Bergman and Mazzetti explained how they were allowed to happen, how they were not stopped, how they were not impeded, how they were seldom prosecuted and never punished. It's a horror story told with scrupulous documentation and riveting prose, for which the Hillman judges have awarded it this year the Hillman Prize for Magazine Journalism. Ronen Bergman is not only based in Tel Aviv, but I am told he's about to be taking paternity leave, so he is not with us tonight. Mark Mazzetti, who was on the same train I was on that got stuck in a tunnel on the way up from DC today, Mark Mazzetti is with us, and so for himself and for Ronen Bergman, I'm delighted to present him with the Hillman Prize for Magazine Journalism.
Thank you. I have to say, this is a really great birthday present. Thank you very much to the Hillman Foundation for this tremendous honor. It's such a privilege to be among the fellow winners tonight and to be among such a distinguished group of past winners of the Hillman Prize for Magazine Journalism. Among those past winners are The Unwanted, William Finnegan's piece for The New Yorker, The Uncounted by my colleagues Azmat Khan and Anant Gopal. So tonight, accepting the award for The Unpunished, I think the trilogy is complete. Just over a year ago, Ronen and I were in the West Bank at an illegal settlement trying to interview a settler named Yonon Levy, who had been at the center of a campaign of violence, theft, and intimidation of Palestinian villagers. The interview didn't go so well. Then, weeks later, Levy was one of only 4 Israeli settlers designated for economic sanctions by the United States, the first time that had ever happened. Those sanctions were lifted during the very first days of the Trump administration. And President Trump has given no indication he will put any pressure on the Netanyahu government to rein in the settler violence. On the contrary, the Trump administration has officials in senior positions who believe that Israel should annex the West Bank. And that would fulfill the dream of many of the people we wrote about in our story. This investigation began with a somewhat basic question. How is it that Israel's Shin Bet, the country's domestic security service, had years of success in curbing terrorism by Palestinian groups, and yet fails so often in stopping attacks against Palestinians by Jewish right-wing ultranationalists? The answer to this question proved to be an answer about far more than just the Shin Bet, or the decisions by individual Israeli leaders, but about the country of Israel itself. The Israeli state had systematically ignored the violence, allowing a sometimes criminal nationalistic movement to operate with impunity and gradually move from the fringes to the mainstream of Israeli society. Many of the people we interviewed, some speaking publicly for the first time, offered account not only of Jewish violence against Palestinians dating back decades, but also of an Israeli state that systematically and increasingly ignored the violence. Voices within the government that objected to condoning settler violence were silenced and discredited. Most of the close to 100 sources interviewed for the story during 8.5 years of reporting, most of it by Ronen, were Israeli officials, giving a blunt account of how the occupation came to threaten the integrity of their country's democracy. This story and the story of the October 7th attacks are part of the same narrative, a story of a region in the Middle East scarred by grief and suffering. Both show what can happen when nations and peoples allow extremists and fundamentalists on both sides to steer the course of history. We'd like to recognize our editor, Luke Mitchell, who was a tireless advocate for the story and patiently navigated over years of stops and starts. He is an expert editor who kept pushing to make the story better and better. Thank you to New York Times Magazine editor Jake Silverstein for recognizing the importance of this topic and giving the story the space to capture the breadth and scope of the issue. A pattern that has repeated itself time and time again since we conducted the first interviews for this story. Current and former senior officials warning of things that were about to get much worse. Their forecasts, initially seen as too bad to be true, kept coming true, turning into tomorrow's reality. In the same way, even the events we documented just a year ago in the final part of the investigation now seem like a mere prelude to something even more dire. For this reason, it is more important than ever for journalists to keep the attention on this story, and we are honored to have played a small part in that. Thank you very much.